I want to start my talk, this is going to be a little bit about my journey and my path, and I want to start off with a riddle that was really popular when I was a kid. And I was a kid just a few years ago. Charlie and I could have been classmates. So the riddle is, a father and a son are involved in a car accident. And it was actually a tragic accident, and the father passed away. And the kid was rushed to the hospital and is about to go into surgery. And the surgeon takes a look at the kid and says, I can't operate on this kid. He's my son. And when I was a kid, this was a really popular riddle. And people would be stumped. And there were all these conspiracy theories about, well, is it an alien child? Was the father a twin? Was the mother a twin? I mean, it was just a ridiculous amongst of reasons why people would put forth. And the more popular ones was that, in fact, the son was adopted, or maybe the child had two fathers. And today, if I tell that riddle, and hopefully you in the room probably already guessed, that the reason that the surgeon couldn't operate on the child is because the surgeon was the child's mother, right? But the success of that riddle really hinged and leveraged two things at the time: probability and odds. What was the probability and what were the odds that at that time a surgeon could be a woman? And what were the probability and the odds that at that time the surgeon could be a mother? And so the odds were obviously fairly low that most people, the majority of people, did not even think of that as a solution to the answer. And so I want you to sit with that concept of the odds back to when I was Charlie's age, 4 or 5 years ago. And now I'm going to ask you, I'm going to move us from a riddle to a scenario, still based on odds, right? But no longer a mother and a son, but rather an astronaut and a neurosurgeon walk into a room. What are the odds? What are the odds of that even happening, right? Because to be an astronaut is a fairly rare thing in our society. To be a neurosurgeon is also a fairly rare thing. So what are the odds of their being in the same room? And then let me ask you, what are the odds of either or both of those being a woman? What are the odds of either or both of those being an underrepresented minority? And then to blow your mind even further, what are the odds of either or both of those being a woman and an underrepresented minority? And I want you to think about those odds, right, and sit with that for a second. And now I'm going to take you to the beginning of my story, right? And spoiler alert, I'm actually going to be the neurosurgeon. So, all right. So years ago, when I was an undergraduate at college, we were honoring, we have all these speakers and academics, and we were honoring one of the speakers who was not yet an astronaut, and I was not yet a neurosurgeon. And I was invited to a dinner to honor this person, and she was going to make history by going into space as the first African-American woman to go into space. And I think that, you guys probably already know by now, this was Mae Jemison, and she would ultimately go into space on the Endeavour. And so I was invited to this dinner, and you could imagine, like as a college student, free food, right? So I was there. And it was an incredible evening. I got to sit with this woman who was about to make history and hear firsthand her journey and her path and her experiences. And the next day, there's a talk. And so I was invited to her talk, and of course I went because now I was invested in this. And I will never forget the title of her talk. It was, what does E equals MC squared have to do with primping in the mirror on a Saturday night? I mean, I was like, wait, what? And, I have given a lot of academic talks, and the titles of my talks are super boring. Like the probability of blah, 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 and we're looking at the frontal lobe and the movement, like never a cool title. And so this happened a few years ago, lying because I was in college, so a long time ago. But I will never forget the sentiments imparted in that title, okay? Incredibly, incredibly brilliant marriage of words. And Dr. Jemison, in that title and in that talk, was taking something as complex as E equals MC squared, and she was marrying it with something simple, something social, something that people could relate to, and we were teenagers at the time, so everybody could relate to getting ready and feeling great on a Saturday night. And she was marrying those two concepts. And again, I don't remember all the details of her talk, right? But that moment in that talk was a bridge, and would be a bridge to my future in science, in healing, and in healthcare. I have to say that, sadly, it was the first time that I thought of science through the realm of something social. And that says a lot about like the education system. And it was the first time that I thought of science as real, right? And again, you don't always remember the details, but I remembered how I felt, and I felt invincible, right? Because for the first time, this meeting with Dr. Jameson, this talk, this title, all of these things came together. And for me, it represented that science could be something social. Science could be real, right? Science could be nuanced. Science could be accessible. And most importantly for me in that moment and at that time, science could be something that I, a then young girl, still young girl, that I could actually do. And never before had I actually felt that. And so I took that moment, that call, all of that, I took it all as a call for me and my future work in science. And I have to say that after that, I had a very, very straightforward path, as straightforward as you could have to become a neurosurgeon, right? So I did finish college, thanks to Dartmouth, and then I went off to medical school. I completed medical school, and then I went to what's called residency in neurosurgery. And along the way, I did a master's in public health. And at that point, trauma became something that I was interested in. But epidemiology was not something that people married with neurosurgery and trauma. But I wanted to use data to better understand disease entities, to better understand things like injury. I wanted to use data to help us understand the odds, to help us understand all of these disease entities. And so one of my first projects that I worked on after I got my epidemiology degree and graduated in neurosurgery was basically looking at large systems and trying to understand trauma systems in different countries. And so I set up a study in 2 different countries, one in the Caribbean and one in the United States. And I sort of modeled them on 2 hospitals that were very high volume hospitals in trauma, both with a mission rooted in serving the underserved, and again, both with expertise in trauma. And I ran this project over the course of a couple years. And what I wanted to look at was the macro trends in these environments. And what I found was incredible. I found that despite all of our expertise in the developed world and all of the resources that we pour into our healthcare system, all of the high technology and everything, that in fact the outcomes in the developed world and the developing world from a traumatic brain injury standpoint were identical. There was no change in mortality at all. And I found this to be peculiar, and I said, am I missing something? And so I started to drill down more and more into the data. And when I looked at the smallest cohort that existed within traumatic brain injury, those who were most severely injured, it was there that I found differences, right? Those cohorts, if you were injured in the United States in the developed world, you actually did a lot better than if you were injured in the developing world. And it highlighted for me that despite our best efforts, right, you can have differential impact. And in fact, we had poured all these resources into all of these cohorts, but not everyone was doing the same. Just this smaller cohort was doing better. And it taught me that our best efforts, all of our resources, you can apply them evenly and still end up with differences. And so what are the underpinnings of those differences? And I took that lesson, and it took me throughout my career. And again, this was like one of the first projects I worked with as a young assistant professor. And by the time I became an associate professor, I continued to look at smaller and smaller cohorts. And my most recent avenue of research and subcohort is looking at those cohorts that are dust in the data sets, things that you would never find unless you were actually looking. And for traumatic brain injury, that's actually gender. and sex differences. So women in those data sets are noise. And so my research now focuses on differential experiences that women can have in these data sets. Because when you look at the general cohort, they have one experience, and when you look at women, right, they have a different experience. And so I continue to understand and to learn that you have to look at recovery and healing through different lenses. And this research has taught me that gender matters in everything that we do, and subcohorts actually matter. The greater cohort cannot only be what we look at and try to understand when we think about healthcare, when we think about research, and when we think about healing. Our work has continued to sought to tease out these differences because I think these differences matter. And sorry, this is interesting, sorry about that. So I want to say that this research has taught me lessons that I learned in that very first experience. Lessons that science cannot just exist in a vacuum. That at all times, science has to continue to be grounded and nuanced. Science has to continue to be real, right? If our goal is to heal everyone, right, then you can't just look through one particular lens. Now, today, at this sort of venue, et cetera, I love the power of youth. I love the fact that people like Charlie and his cohort think differently, right? They create platforms and tools that allow us to think differently about everything. I think when we leave here today, my hope is that, that he would have accomplished that. And so years ago, now that I've done all of this research, I've gotten people hopefully to think differently about clinical strategies and to think differently about neuroscience, I finally became a professor of neurosurgery. And all of a sudden, I was awarded a platform, right? And the reporter asked me, what does your becoming a professor mean for STEM? And I thought to myself, wow, you know, that's a lofty question. And what I realized was that the underpinnings of that question were rooted in odds and probability. And it brought me back to that famous riddle, and it brought me back to that first experience. And as I reflected on the answer to that question, I realized that what she was asking was that now that you have defied the odds, so to speak, what are you going to do to continue to make sure that those perspectives continue to be represented and reflected in the work that exists and the work that needs to be done? Essentially, I think what she was saying was, you know, how are you going to change the odds? And so beyond my clinical work, beyond my research, beyond my community endeavors, I have then focused myself to answering that question, to priming the pipeline, and to basically creating a generation of individuals who I hope, like Charlie, will change the odds. Because I realize that access and opportunity in the sciences and STEM are limited. And you need to bring more people to the table. That's the only way that we're going to change these perspectives. And so years later, when I was obviously now a neurosurgeon, and Dr. Jameson was obviously now an astronaut, I was invited to another meal, and this time it was lunch. And I was invited again, and I think maybe because people do think that I like free meals. But nonetheless, I went to this meal, and I got there early, and I was super, super excited because I thought, this was going to be our time, our moment. Like, she was going to see me from across the room. We were going to hug. It was going to be like a thing. And so I get there, and I sit down, and it was actually a very small lunch. And we went around the room, and we were introducing ourselves, and it came to me. And I sort of, you know, said, oh, I'm Odette Harris. Like, we met years ago. And, you know, I told her the story. I told her how she had impacted my perspective on science, how she had ignited and inspired me to think about science as something that I could do with my life, and that I'd ultimately done that. And I know this is not a spoiler alert to you guys, but she didn't actually remember me, right? I mean, she was sort of like, oh, that's lovely, you know? And I sort of laughed in the moment and in reflection, because this woman had been to space, right? She had like lived this ridiculous life, and I don't remember people I've met on Earth, right? Like there are people who are like, do you remember me? And so it was actually, again, a reflection of my own self-centered naivete. But nonetheless, it was a wonderful afternoon, because Dr. Jameson did what she always did. She inspired everybody in that room. She just like ignited us all. And it was a reminder to me of the importance of doing that and the work that continues and needs to be done, right? She continued in that afternoon to make science real. She continued to outline and demonstrate for us that science was nuanced. And she continued to reinforce that science has to be accessible to all. And so I actually think it's pretty quite obvious to everyone here that like I'm never gonna be an astronaut. And I'm never gonna go into space, so I'm never gonna be Mae Jemison. But I'm proud that because of her and her inspiration, that there's a generation like scientists like me, women and underrepresented minorities, right? A growing body of us who understand that importance and who a generation can look to and understand that they too can be scientists, right? A generation that understand that they too can do neurosurgery in the morning, brain surgery, and be mothers and do pickup in the afternoon. That there's a generation that understand, right, that science can be real in their lives. That they too can primp in the mirror on a Saturday night and also understand the concepts of E equals MC squared. So when an astronaut and a neurosurgeon walk into a room for this generation, right, it's not a riddle, it's not a joke, right? But in fact, for this generation, it is an undisputed reality because of people like Dr. Jameson and the work that we are doing and the platforms kids like Charlie are creating, that we recognize that we can actually change the odds. And this, no one will question that both of those individuals are women. No one will question and be stumped by such a riddle, right? And they can appreciate that both can be women, both can be underrepresented minority, and that only by changing the odds and bringing everyone to the table do we really truly make impact in healing. And so thank you again, Charlie. So appreciate your giving us this opportunity.